I'm sometimes called a contrarian, as if I sit and think, how am I going to make people angry today? But really, it's that I write what I think, and sometimes it makes a lot of people angry, but I figure so many people must agree with me that I'm going to write it anyway. But it's hard to write angry books. You spend all this time. And so my pattern has generally been that if I write an angry one, then I want to write a happy one after. And so usually if it's angry, it's going to be about race. And then I think, okay, now I've got the taste of ash in my mouth. I want to write something that will make people laugh and where I'm having a good time. This was that.
Alrighty, let's get started. Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Melissa Kane. I'm a legal and political analyst and your moderator for this evening. Before we begin, a few reminders. Tonight's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. Also, if you have any questions for our guests, please fill them out on the cards that were on your seats, or if you're joining us online, you can just put them in the YouTube chat. And now it is my pleasure to announce tonight's guest. He has a PhD in linguistics from Stanford, and from 1995 to 2002, he taught at Berkeley, so serious Bay Area ties there. And today he teaches linguistics, American studies, and music history at Columbia University. He's also the host of a podcast called Lexicon Valley and writes a weekly column for the New York Times. He's the author of many, many books, including a new one called Pronoun Trouble, The Story of Us in 7 Little Words. Everyone, please join me in welcoming John McWhorter.
Thank you.
So, Professor McWhorter, I have to say, when I got the email about this event and I saw your name, I thought, oh boy, because I think a lot of us were introduced to you through your book Woke Racism.
I remember that one. Yes.
So I saw you'd written a book about pronouns. I thought, oh boy, it's going to be a barn burner. But actually, the New York Times gave you a great review.
And
if that tells you anything.
They kind of did. That's right. Yeah, but no, it's not a barn burner in that way, is it?
No, it isn't. You've actually sort of gone in. People might think you're making a departure, but the truth is this is closer to what you had written prior in your other books. So talk about the through line, or sort of how you were feeling after Woke Racism and what led you to make this your next one.
Yeah, there's a pattern, which is that I'm sometimes called a contrarian, as if I sit and think, how am I going to make people angry today? But really, it's that I write what I think, and sometimes it makes a lot of people angry, but I figure so many people must agree with me that I'm going to write it anyway. But it's hard to write angry books. You spend all this time. And so my pattern has generally been that if I write an angry one, then I want to write a happy one after. And so usually if it's angry, it's going to be about race. And then I think, okay, now I've got the taste of ash in my mouth. I want to write something that will make people laugh and where I'm having a good time. This was that, because Woke Racism was written in a summer of bourbon-fueled rage. I just was angry. And then I finished it, and I thought, well, that was unpleasant, but that needed to be written. What's the happy thing now? And then I thought, yay, pronouns. I was not thinking about they and trans issues, et cetera. In 1923, let's pretend it was then. Films were silent, Calvin Coolidge was president, and so I'm writing in 1923, although actually 2023.
It seems like that long ago.
It already does. And I was just thinking it's about happy, jolly pronouns. But now it all has a different flavor, and it seems like I'm writing about issues that now are often rather fraught. But that's just an accident.
Well, yes, and for folks who aren't necessarily on board with things like using they, which is one of the things you kind of call for in the book, there are many other chapters on each of the pronouns, on I and we and you and she and he. So plenty to read and like for even people who might disagree on other subjects. Let's get started by, we're all word nerds here, probably. You're a linguist. What is a pronoun? Let's just define it and talk about why they're important.
The pronoun stands in for a noun itself. And so first you say, Florence was in the living room and then she picked up a flower pot and she asked, why are these flowers made of plastic? You wouldn't say Florence was in the living room and Florence picked up flowers and Florence asked. So the pronoun stands in for something that you've established the identity of. So it can also be this. And so we're going to talk about trout fishing in Quebec. This is an interesting topic to very few people. But then this is pronouns. And so that's what a pronoun is. They are these little stand-ins for something that we've been more specific about before.
As stand-ins, one academically might think that these are not that important, right? It's kind of a placeholder, kind of a quick identifier. And yet they have become so important, or they feel so important. I feel like if someone referred to me as Melissa and then said he, that would really take me aback, even though it probably shouldn't. It's just a little placeholder. It would, it's not that big of a deal in some abstract way, but it's hard to divorce that sort of jarring the jarring nature of being mispronounced or what pronouns can mean for people.
Yeah, now you're getting into gender, and yes, I mean, we have very deep-seated senses of what gender looks like, sounds like, feels like, and pronouns often are indexed to that. And you use pronouns a lot. If we were going to roll the tape back and just start again, pronouns wouldn't even be considered words. They'd be considered something else. And many linguists see them as actually a kind of grammar rather than as a word. And so, since they're so deeply seated, to change how we use he and she, that's hard. That's like changing how you use, the fourth finger on your right hand, like not touching anything with it all day. That'd be really hard because we're used to doing it in a certain way. That's why the gendering issue is so touchy or tetchy, you might say, because it's deep-seated in the way that we perceive the world around us.
And you talk in the book about some cultures where you have pronoun, where languages change and they morph, but pronouns are this thing that are so impossible and so unchanging, despite other sort of growing and evolution of language.
It's good. There are many good things about you, I am sure, although we just met. One of the good ones is that I can tell you actually read the book. And so, yes, the pronouns do not change easily. And so the example that I give in the book is that there is, how to say this without it sounding like I'm too far in the weeds. There is a language spoken in Nepal by literally one person now. There is a language spoken down on those tiny islands next to India where sometimes you hear stories about cultures there that really don't want anybody to come in. Even missionaries can't come, the Andaman Islands. And so there's a language there, there's a language here. They are completely different. They don't belong to the same families, but their pronouns are oddly the same. These people and these people have to have been separated by a good 50,000 years, and the pronouns have virtually just sat still. That's how much languages don't like to change their pronouns. And so that's part of why it's so hard if somebody tells us to use they in a new way or to introduce some new pronoun.
And one of the pronouns that you talk about, which warmed my heart as a Southerner, is y'all. You really, first of all, I love that you give it a serious treatment, and it is one of these. I think it's a perfectly good word, and it's been knocking at the door, but it still has not been accepted into the club of grown-up pronouns. But you call it exquisite, and you really go into why it fills a need that we have in our language versus other languages.
Y'all is delicious, and it's easy to miss it. English doesn't have enough pronouns. We are a very pronoun-poor language. There are very few languages I can think of, not that I know all of them in the world, that put just a few pronouns through so much hell as this language does. So we're always trying to develop new ones. And so, for example, to only have one way of saying you, where it's both singular and plural, that's odd. If you've ever tried to learn any other language, except depending on what kind of Hindi you were exposed to, that's not the way languages go. You're supposed to have a tu and a vous. You're supposed to have tu and usted. You're supposed to have du and sie. You're supposed to have thi and vi. That's what all European languages do, except English, for reasons no one's ever figured out. And so we're always trying to, for one thing, have a plural you by saying something like y'all or yous or yins, and it's just considered slang because language was standardized before those things set in. But then more to the point, y'all is used with one person, we're often taught, if we're kind of at 2.0, we're taught that y'all is not one person, that a Southerner doesn't say, do y'all have a sore tooth or something like that, and that's true. But if somebody says, y'all come back you here, to one person and has no idea who they're with, it's not that they're doing something wrong, it's polite. It's a way of saying vous instead of tu. So, not you person I barely know, you come back you here. What you say is, well, if there might be somebody else out in the car, you probably consider yourself part of a group of people, y'all come back you here. That is English having its own vous. And you listen to these things around you. Something happened to me today. I'm going to try to remember. I'm jet lagged. Got to the hotel. And so we're here in San Francisco. This is not Kentucky. This is San Francisco. And the person, what's the person called at the desk who?
The concierge?
Except not the concierge, the other one.
The receptionist?
Let's call her that. So the receptionist is helping me with things. And she says, okay, so we're going to take your bags back there, and the elevator is right there. She didn't mean that there was some bellboy or something. She meant, I'm going to take the bags back. But instead she said, okay, we're going to take the bags back here, and there's the elevator. Why did she say we? Because to say you are going to take the bags back, I wouldn't have minded. But if she says we, it takes the camera back, and you've got some distance. She was wooing me. That's what she was doing. She wouldn't have thought of it that way, and I didn't tell her, you said we. But that was another example of that sort of thing. Receptionist? The clerk?
You could say clerk?
Clark. Okay, so whatever she is. Okay.
Well, I think, look, for a lot of us who have, not studied linguistics, we just read, and pronouns are kind of like pornography. You sort of know it when you see it. Like, you can go, I feel like that works. And no, that doesn't work. Without thinking about the rules. But one of the great things about your book is you do go through these rules and show how we don't always adhere to them, and even how we've lost some things over time. And one of my favorite parts is where you talk about the you and the thou, and even bring in Shakespearean examples of how basically the you and thou had, I'm going to say the word class, but yeah, had sort of power dynamics built into them. And so someone would start talking to you using one word and then end using another. And what that signified was a shift in the conversation. And I think it's so interesting because for us, like, I would read that and go, oh, that's just, old-timey language. I don't really know, but without understanding that these small changes in these words that we don't use anymore really did have meaning back then and made things a little richer.
Yeah, and I can't claim to be able to hear it in real time either, but in Othello, the way people use thou and you is subtle and it's rich. At one point, Othello will be talking to Desdemona and saying you, and then he says thou. When he says thou, even I just think to myself, there goes that pleasant, archaic, poetic language. But no, he said you before. When he says thou, it's kind of like a black man saying baby when he does that. It's like, whoa, thou. That's what he means. And when the men talk to each other, some of them only refer to one another as you because they're men of class, whereas other ones refer to one another as thou and say thou to one another. It was richer then. We had more. Now we do it with these understated we's and y'all come back, but it used to be more overt, just as it tends to be in normal languages, which English is not one of.
And when we lost thou, it sort of was this democratization where we sort of lost the fancier term, and so now everybody is you. Right. And one of the things that you talk about, and I love this because I find this word funny, is the word yeet. Y-E-E-T. Used to be a real word. Like now it has its own meaning of like, sort of throwing something. It means
the kids are using it.
The kids say yeet. But it was an actual part of speech.
It was. You had a singular thou, you had a bunch of you, and you had two yeet. And so yeet, sit there, thou, sit there. And yeet was an actual pronoun.
We need to bring this back.
We need it. The object form was ink, believe it or not. And so, he's going to get ink, and that meant he's going to get you two for, knocking over that lamp or something like that. That's what English used to be, and now we're just stuck with just you and you and you. We're not normal.
Well, so one of the things you get to in the book is a call for to sort of alleviate some of the work that our sparse pronouns have to do, is to bring in the use of the word they. And I want to distinguish two uses of the word they, because there's actually one use that I think a lot of people do already. I know I do, where I use the word they in place of he or she, because it's just very clunky. So, hey, John, if you're coming to my picnic and you're bringing a date, let me know what they want to eat, right? Instead of what he or she wants. So you just, I think that for ease of use is something that a lot of people already do, even though it's not approved by the AP standard.
Many people say you shouldn't, but frankly, they die. And we are still here. And so, yes, that singular they, I think really the horse was out of the barn. Yeah. But I can tell where you're going. There's another.
So, because I think people say, oh, you should use they, them. And it's like, well, yeah, I already kind of do. But what you're talking about is a different, is that, but also in a different context, which is where you know who the person is. It's just as a gesture to their preference. When you say, you know, Janet got her nails done.
And they wish they had done it in a different color. Yeah. Sure.
Exactly. So you know who the person is, and you know what their you know what they would prefer to be called. It's
Exactly.
a specific, a more specific use of that. Can you talk about how you came to that decision? Because people might, given some of your prior work, think that this is a little different.
Because I'm supposedly so conservative.
Yes,
but
you are.
Yeah, but I'm just not when it comes to the they. The new they is designed to address the idea that biological sex is one thing, but then gender, we might get rid of the binary. And that's become an idea explored so much and has been accepted by so many people that the language needs a pronoun to do it. And many people's first thought is that this would be a great way to invent some pronoun. That would be a lot of fun, but because pronouns are so deeply seated, they are so instinctual, you can't make up a new one. You want to, and you think that that might work because you figure you can say, here it is. But people won't take it because we're too busy using the pronouns. And so some people have used Z, but it's small circles of people who are extremely, extremely committed to it. There are various attempts over the decades to make them up, and they just never stick. And so we need, unfortunately, to use something we have. And English already doesn't have much. And so we have to use the pronoun that was already being used gender neutrally before, and that was they. So we have a task ahead of us in that way.
Well, you've also proposed maybe even capitalizing it for purposes of you sort of making it clear I'm talking about a specific individual versus a plurality.
Yeah, I was reading something last night, actually, with they, where it was confusing because they can now mean so many things, and it was the non-binary they. Everything would have been easier if the T had been capitalized for the non-binary usage and then left lowercase if it's other theys. And so I really do think that would be a good idea. It wouldn't work at the beginning of a sentence, but then maybe a new form of deft editing would be to nudge that pronoun away from the beginning of the sentence when possible so that the capital has meaning. But I think that would make it easier in terms of reading. In terms of speaking, we might be stuck with the way it is now, but I think we can do it.
I read so you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about this, and I read the comments. Just not all of them.
I didn't, for the record, so tell me what they said.
Oh, boy. Well, it was interesting. I mean, aside from the folks who just, look, this whole conversation requires an acceptance of something that is not he or she, right? So if you believe that there are only two genders or that's the only thing you're willing to say, then this is not for you. So there were those folks who just sort of were at that threshold.
I refuse to countenance this fiction, that letter. Right.
Yes. Yeah. But the others were split between two. And one sort of group wanted a new word, right? I think that the one that I saw was... what did I wrote
got an avalanche of emails.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of them, but it was something like dare, and D.
Boy, I can't wait until that actually happens.
Yeah,
See, that's the problem.
It's going to catch on like fire. I was trying to write it down. Anyway, so half of them said, new word, and I think you've established that you don't think that is a thing. There's literally a whole section of the book called "A Created Pronoun, No Matter How Clever, Will Never Catch On."
I did write that.
Yes,
yeah.
you did. But the other half wanted to use it. And yes. And I also, it was interesting, your book put words around it. I sort of feel something about that word, but you actually sort of explain why maybe we feel something about that word.
It can't work, unfortunately, because it doesn't connote in English a person, or if it does, it's the Addams family. And frankly, it's getting to the point where only people of a certain age are even going to get that reference, including the new manifestations of it. And that was a joke. And that's because he and she have what we'll call personness in them. because of the nature, the beautiful lights, and I'm wearing glasses, they're not as clean as they could be. I can't see any faces. I'm sure probably two of you I recognize as ex-students or something like that. And that means that I don't know which one of you are linguists. I don't know if I've got linguists out there, so I'm not going to say animacy. I'm just going to say personness. He and she are in it. It isn't. And so if you're a language where you've got three genders and things can be neuter and also be people, so if you're Russian, for example, where that works, they can use ano. They can use their word it as a non-binary pronoun. They don't love doing it, but it doesn't feel as ridiculous as it does to us because our it's aren't people, so it sounds like an insult, so we can't use it.
How are other languages dealing with this issue? Because I always thought, I remember high school, Georgia Public School, French class, and learning that there are things in French, for example, and other languages that have masculine and feminine. And I remember thinking, oh, good Lord, now I have to remember, now I have to memorize this. You know, I had my little flashcards of like, home is female, school is male. Like, it seemed
All
like
European languages, but English for the most part, yeah.
it seemed like theirs was so gendered, and ours, I was so glad that we didn't really have that much of an infusion in our language. How are other places where gender is so infused dealing with this, with these sort of issues?
Yeah, with many of them, it's very awkward because there's an ending, on practically every verb that is gendered. How do you come up with a new ending? Are you going to say boy and the boy one and the girl one together, or in what order are you going to say it? I think, frankly, in many of the languages you're talking about, especially most European languages and then some of the Middle East, it's a pretty hopeless endeavor in most of the grammar because there's just too much gender. But with the pronouns, there are nice attempts at new pronouns happening in, from what I've seen, most European languages where there's often some elegant combination of their word for he and she. So in French, il is he, she is elle, il is the pronoun that they've created. There are a lot of ils all over Europe. Some countries are more into it than others, but it's very much a sign of the times to have a non-binary pronoun of some kind. To have the endings be things like X or mixtures, no one's ever going to do that beyond certain extremely committed circles. But the pronouns themselves, maybe, we have to see.
So not like a she, he. I mean, you actually have a chapter called she, he. I'm sorry, I gotta say it.
So silly.
She, he, it happens.
See, the joke was it was supposed to be
She,
shit happens, but it's he, she, it. And so, yeah. But we can't be the...
Not although
and
that would be snappy.
And the pronouns in Europe are actually kind of like heesh in a way, but they are more transparent. Heesh, you have to be told is he and she, and heesh didn't work in the 70s, but there are many things like that being proposed in Europe.
All right, so your book is called Pronoun Trouble. Oh, and by the way, I have a question to ask you because the New York Times did favorably review the book, but one of the questions that they had, we can just dispel the mystery right here.
I've only read that review very quickly.
All right, so it's quite good. But here's one excerpt. It is not hard to suspect that McWhorter also has a sly eye on Judith Butler's 1990 work, Gender Trouble, which is more or less the founding text for decoupling of biological sex from lived gender and latterly the practice of sharing one's pronouns.
No.
So, sir, are you now, or have you ever been inspired by Gender Trouble to call your book Pronoun Trouble?
No, I'm not that profound. And Judith Butler used to work near my office at Berkeley. I'm very aware of her. I remember when that Pronoun Trouble book came out, I pretended to have read it, etc. But no, I was not thinking of that at all. I was sitting on a sun porch, not drinking bourbon, and I was thinking about Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. And when Daffy Duck says, that's it, pronoun trouble. And I thought that's going to be the title of the book. I was not thinking about Judith Butler. I was not thinking about anything so glum and serious. That's what people keep saying. So no, it's not. I'm not sly. I was thinking about Bugs Bunny.
There are several cartoon references in the book. Thoroughly enjoyed, sir.
I love cartoons.
Glad that you did that. So yeah, for some folks, the sort of the they them isn't going to happen, and I worry that. So the word trouble, I think, is a really good one because when people think that there is trouble or perceive that they're looking at something that's troubling, instead of using the word they or them, my worry is that they will change the way they write and speak to avoid the trouble, as opposed to sort of dealing with it head on as you propose. So, and that leads to, I know I think I've done it a few times where I've tried to just sort of avoid any issue by rejiggering my sentences.
Sure.
And it usually results in the passive voice, which I don't like, but sometimes is inevitable. But I just mean, like, there can be cascading effects from people who just say, I don't even want to deal with this. This is confusing. I don't want to make it more complicated by capitalizing they or whatever. So I'm just going to actually change the way I speak or write. Is that something that you've experienced yourself or that you're concerned about?
A little, yeah. I don't know that I've ever written a new non-binary they. I think subconsciously I have written around it, maybe with the passive or other creative things that you can do. I imagine that as these things settle in more, we'll, dip our toes in and start getting more comfortable with these sorts of things. After a while, it becomes a habit just because it's nothing, you see nothing but that around you. I'm not too worried about that. If something catches on, it catches on. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And we can't know. I was very confident in 2023 that the new they was with us for good. I write about it in that book as if we're just going to have to deal with it.
I wasn't going to say it, but
yeah, I was going to say, I would say that 2 years later, I am happy to deal with it, but I see signs that maybe it was a fad of the late teens and early 2000s. Late teens and early 2020s. Sorry about the jet lag. I can imagine it becoming something that people do in movies in the 2050s when they want to set it in the 2020s with the they. But we can't know yet. We're right on the cusp. Like, ask me next year. But if we're going to keep it, I think that we can get into the habit, partly because we do other things that feel unnatural, such as saying, Billy and I went to the store. Notice that no child says that at first. You have to be taught to do that. And the reason is that it's not really a rule of English. It's something that people started making up in the 1700s because Latin does it that way. French doesn't. And nobody ever criticizes French for, Guillaume et moi went to the store. But in English, we're taught this rule that makes no sense. And yet, I can, without effort, with the bourbon, asleep, I can say, Billy and he went to the store, or, she and her mother decided to find a new bathing suit or something. You get good at it because you don't want to look vulgar. But that doesn't mean that it's real. And so if we've mastered that, Billy and I went to the store, and we're teaching our 5-year-olds to speak unnaturally in order to not be ridiculed. I think we can learn to use they in new ways as well.
Well, yeah, I think that we could. I don't know, if, to your point, if the will is still there. It feels like such a long time ago, 2023.
Remember that?
Simpler time.
Yeah.
Way back then. Well, and I do think that part of the issue is, even now, is that for some folks who said, fine, you want to use they, I'll call you they, I don't really, whatever. I'm polite, I'll call you whatever you want. But then that led to, I think in people's minds, even though you might disagree with the order of things here, that led to then changes in spaces, like prisons and locker rooms and sports and things like that. And they go, well, look, I don't like where that led. So I'm going to pull all the way back and we're not even going to do that anymore. And so I think that's part of the change in feelings around the pronouns is like, I want to, I pulled on a string a little bit and it just went into a place I didn't want to go.
Good analogy.
Now, you wrote in 2014, you wrote a book called The Language Hoax about how, and you correct me here, how it is not the case that language makes culture, that it's the case that culture is reflected in the language. But do you still think that? And how do you square that with the way the perception is that the language, that the indulging in the pronoun request led to unintended consequences?
Well, the way I see it is that to have a new way of using they can be seen as creating a mindset that will be more open to what you're calling spaces, and I'll add sports, et cetera, and all of those sorts of things. Those things get adjudicated with basically long-term and often stressful national conversations. I think, from what I see, and this is just me, I think that it is advanced to explore the idea that you're certainly born a boy or a girl. I'm going to say that out loud. That's just the way genes and chromosomes are. But that we are not imprisoned by that, and that we can maybe choose what we want to identify as. As far as I'm concerned, a society that does that, I don't think history is going to judge that poorly. And I know that a lot of comment sectioners feel very differently. I think some of them lack imagination. I can see this happening. Maybe it's partly because I'm an academic, but I don't think that's the only reason. I think that we can have that without the spaces and the sports and the things that many people see as excesses, which my guess is history is not going to be as kind to. But you can have the pronoun one without. Now, I'm going to get in trouble here, but frankly, the conversation is changing. And we both know what we're talking about. You can have the new they without somebody named Leah Thomas, who was born a man, competing in swimming with women and being larger than all of them and winning and pumping their fists in the air because they won. I think all of us understand that that's a tough one. You can have not that, and you can also have they, and using that as a more advanced conception of what gender is. So that's what I really think of that. I wasn't thinking about any of that when I wrote that book, but I have to now, so yeah.
So you don't necessarily think that the use of the pronoun they is going to lead to, or?
It doesn't have to, no. And I think many people think it will, but what they're missing is that how language works doesn't condition thought that strongly. It's a very weak effect. It's more like tiny sparkles rather than the grand shifting of the mental machinery that many people think. And I really think that we could have a more humane pronoun system while having other conversations about the other things that we're talking about.
And in this conception, people would have to identify, I mean, you would sort of use the he or she, and then they would tell you if they wanted to be identified as they, essentially, as opposed to just calling everybody they, just in case.
Which is what some people have tried to do. Right, yeah, I think that'll be something that emerged in the 20-teens and that after a while we'll see as just what is normal. Ms. happened, for example. I was calling somebody Miss the other day. It was my daughter. I was getting a plane ticket and they were asking what people want to be called. And I was thinking, well, she's 13. Is she Ms.? And then I thought, no, I think she's still Miss. And I thought, I haven't used Miss in so long, but I think if it's a child, but really it's Ms. I would never call anybody over 16 Miss. And somebody 50 years ago would be in a louder blazer and complaining about that. Saying, what's Ms.? But I'm not saying that. So,
if you had a son, would it be a Mr. if he was, 12?
Well, at 12, he's Master. Remember Master?
No.
I was Master when I was young.
Really?
Yeah, when
Always get to be Master?
And now I'm just now thinking about what some people would see as the implications of that. But I remember my parents very proudly.
I'm just going to tweet that quote. Just like
I was Master John McClure. I don't think people use that anymore. And there's no little Mister. There's no junior or something.
Junior Miss.
Junior Miss.
That's a different pageant.
Radio show. But no, but Miss is quite archaic at this point, unless somebody is 10, right? And that happened in the early 70s. We got used to it.
I don't know. I mean, whenever I hear that, I feel like it's like I'm in trouble. Like,
oh,
Miss,
yeah. Well, Miss,
you
right.
know,
Yeah.
If somebody says that to me, I'm like, I was just curious if there was still because no one would say that, would say Master for any number of reasons anymore. But for a young boy, we don't have the equivalent of Miss.
No.
We just call him Mr.
It really
as if he were a grown-up.
It was a thing probably into the 80s. It wasn't just my family, Master for the little boy. But it went out, actually. Yeah.
You're good with that.
Yeah.
And I just want to point, so the book is purple.
It is purple, and that was deliberate.
He has achieved a state of literary prominence where you get to pick the color.
They wanted to make it green. And I said I would prefer purple. I think it would pop more. And really, it's just that I like that color. So
His favorite color. That's another reason to buy the book. John McWhorter's favorite color. Okay. So as you're writing the book, I found there were so many great little gems in there, including the fact that the word she could have, if we were in a different world, been shoe.
Oh, yeah.
So, ladies, think about that. Like next time. I was like, really? Just sort of a freak of historical, sort of happenstance that the way it went was she and not shoe. But there are all sorts of interesting things like that. So tell me about your process of researching for this, and what are your favorite things that you came across?
Well, yeah, she in Old English was heya, of all things, heya. There was hey, that was he, and then she was heya. You can think of it as kind of like he with a feminine A, although really it was an O. And hey and heya came together. If you said heya too fast, it was hey. And so English was creating its own gender-neutral pronoun with just the he, but it didn't like it, and so she developed instead. She was originally a word that meant that feminine gendered thing or person. And so you would say that moon, and it would be Saya moon. Saya, if you say that again and again, becomes she. People started saying that one, except meaning a woman. Most of us might remember when John McCain unartfully referred to Barack Obama as, well, blah, 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 the taxes. That one thinks that blah, 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 blah. It was awkward, but you can use the language that way. Imagine if Barack Obama were a woman and somebody said that one. That word in Old English became she. And so that was a weird
Hold my earrings. Like,
right. It's so obnoxious, but that is what became she. And so that's what happened with she. My process of research was rummaging around in Old and Middle English over the past 3 decades and just getting a kick out of how different they are from modern English. And then it was, writing a book and thinking what I know would be interesting to anybody but me and about 42 scholars of Old and Middle English who also study that kind of thing. And the subset of that is in this book. But you learn, and I'm not a deliberate Old or Middle English specialist, but I have interests that make me pay attention to both of those languages for other reasons. And after a while, you know enough about them that you can at least fake it. And with Old English in particular, I've never deliberately thought I'm going to learn this. But then gradually I realized, I can almost read this without the dictionary just because I've seen so many of the sentences and there's only so much of it. So after a while, you know that heya was what she was. So I guess what I'm saying is accidental, nerdy study over the decades, and then you realize there could be a book about the pronouns. That
gives me hope.
It's not
for my own nerdy pursuits, that someday I could bring them together
on
somehow.
a rainy day. And all this is before phones. That's another thing. And so when books, were what you had, that also helped.
Well, I did want to ask you about this because in the book you do talk about the dynamism of the language, and when I say dynamic, I mean small changes over centuries.
Right.
But the idea that books and bring in this whole new layer of experts who then can police the grammar in ways that a spoken language doesn't really get necessarily policed, and sort of start setting down rules. And does that calcify the language, or does that, now that everything is in writing, everything is text, essentially, are we seeing another round of sort of linguistic dynamism? I mean, I think what I'm asking is sort of what is the impact of print on the spoken language?
Print makes a language change more slowly than it ordinarily would. It's hard for us to perceive that because we speak a very, very printed language. If a language is nothing but a mouthful of air, as Anthony Burgess put it in one book about language, then it changes much more quickly because you can't remember what was going on before roughly your great-grandparents. And if you're not using those words, the words are just gone. Once they're not in memory, you can't resuscitate them. And so things move along. And you can't encounter the language statically on the page. You don't think of it as letters sitting on a white background. And so most of the world's languages are moving along very quickly and even becoming what are practically new languages in just, say, 1,000 years. That doesn't happen with a language like English unless there's some major incursion. So a lot of the difference between Beowulf and this language is the invasion of French and Latin words. That was unusual, as was what the Normans did. But under just ordinary conditions, if you've got print, the language just sits there. And that's why the Icelanders, for example, can read the sagas with very little trouble, because it just print holds a language back. So there's that. Nevertheless, there's always change, especially in the spoken language. The written language changes glacially, but the spoken language does champ at the bit. But you have to know what to watch for, because a lot of the things are under the radar, or they're rejected as slang, but really in the eyes of God or whatever's up there, it's the language changing. So y'all and yins and yous are new pronouns. We think of them as jokes, but they're new pronouns. And y'all is really becoming something that is more used in more and more spaces, because we really do want something other than you. But it'll never be Wall Street Journal language, and that's because we think of it as slang. But it's actually the language changing. That's what slang is.
What about y'all instead of they?
For a person?
Yeah, I'm trying to find a way to legitimize y'all. Can we?
Roberta is at the airport, and y'all is wondering whether y'all can get a haircut there. See, that doesn't work. It has to be they.
Well, agree to disagree.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, so we have questions from the audience. How do you think language, especially pronouns, serves as a tool for both personal and collective empowerment? Yeah, I mean, like how important is it?
Part of empowerment is using language in a way that reaches people's hearts as well as their minds. And so that means having more of a sensitivity to the difference between vernacular and formal, and being able to possibly use both. That's a way that I think our society is more advanced than previous versions of it, in the way that I'm thinking the new they could render a society more advanced. But being able to use the vernacular in useful ways. And I think also with empowerment, there is knowing how to craft a message so that you don't dawdle, you don't drag, that you don't hang. There's a certain value to concision that I think actually we've lost in this society over about the past 50 or 60 years because of the cult of the informal. It was inevitable. But there used to be a such thing as first elocution lessons, and then even today there's Toastmasters, and Toastmasters can seem so quaint, but that's a useful skill to know how to hold it in. But yes, language can be used for empowerment, but not if it's too formal, not today. Mitt Romney did not become president partly because he was a man of the 1930s and 40s oratorically. You need to be able to get down a little bit more. Now, there are people who take that to extremes, but the happy medium, I think, is useful for moving people, for grassroots efforts.
I think that there is a concern sometimes that language isn't enough, right? I mean, you can't just be like, well, I've sent the email using their preferred pronouns. I'm an ally, and now I'm done. I'm a good person. I'm good. That it can suck the air out of other conversations or other kinds of power, other kinds of ways of organizing, and other useful tools. If we're hung up on words, are we taking our eye off the ball? Are words just a very small part of? Would you encourage people to say, okay, listen, go with the words, but really you need to be getting out the vote or other things?
Yeah, I mean, language in that sense, the idea that you police language and you think that you're going to change thought by keeping people from saying long lists of words or even short lists of words, that feels very natural to us now. But it's amazing reading about or listening to people talking about activism in the old days, how little concern there was with terminology. The idea was to change thought, like to sound pretentious. There is a a big biography of James Baldwin that is coming out soon. I was sent a pre-copy of it, and I've always found him interesting. So I'm in the middle of it, and he's hanging out with activists, and Lorraine Hansberry is making speeches, et cetera, et cetera. And I always find myself thinking, none of them are sitting there smoking their cigarettes and drinking their martinis and saying, we're going to say unhoused instead of homeless. There was none of that. It was, you're working on policy to make it so that there are fewer unhoused people. And I always think, if I walked in, I poured a martini and start smoking cigarettes and saying, well, why don't we talk about terminology? I think a lot of them would think that we were the most trivial people in many ways. They'd say, why don't you think about thought? And I think they would have been right. It's easy with the phones to come up with lists and distribute them, and there's a certain drama to it. But it's, I'm afraid it's activism light. And so that use of language, I think we need to be careful about. I thought we were talking about rhetoric and grammar, but yeah.
Oh, we're bouncing around. We're bouncing around. Question here: what is the biggest takeaway that you want readers to gain from the book?
There isn't one, but okay, what's my favorite thing in it? That English's pronouns once were. Pronouns tend to be very conservative. English is unusual. Our pronouns used to be quite different from the way they are, and the story of how they got from here to there gives us a sense of how we can expect the language to move along in the future and how we feel about language change in general. It can be sobering to see what English was like. In early Middle English, it's basically still Old English, but in late Middle English, just to see these are people speaking English, they're speaking our language, and yet so many things are so very different. And it just moves along, just as, dinosaurs became birds and all mammals used to be these little shrews and now they're us, that sort of thing. That kind of change is amazing. It happens in language too, and not just in slang, but also in the pronouns.
Excellent. Yeah, I got the same message actually, which was that language moves, and we should be open to allowing it to move a little further ourselves.
Always moving. What did somebody say around me the other day? Somebody, instead of saying, yes, that's right, it was somebody under 21, they kept saying, facts. And I thought, is this a thing? And so I asked somebody, and yes, that is what some of the kids are saying. Instead of that's right, they say facts. Another person was, it was this same person who's not the concierge, and maybe we call it the clerk. One of them about 6 months ago was saying to me, period. And so, period. And at first I thought, period what? And then I realized that what she meant was right. That's change. One of those is going to really catch on and sit. Like the last one I remember really catching on was word, which was black slang. That started as a really hot, hip thing to say. Now they're white toddlers saying it. And now there's competition. I wonder if it's going to be facts or period. Another one is bet. If you listen to a young person, blah, 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 and they're saying to each other, bet. Okay? And so let's see which one of those things catches on. But that's language changing.
Word.
So what you did there.
Okay, we got, what do you think the future is of other small words like articles and conjunctions? Are they going to undergo similarly meaningful shifts? I mean, we already do see, I think a lot, especially in informal communications. The absence of apostrophes, things like that. You're not allowed to use capitals. Apparently, everyone thinks you're yelling at them. So those kinds of things. You see those among your own children, or even. And I know you've been on a sabbatical for a bit, but among the kids that you teach.
I think the way we use articles, for the most part, is going to stay the same because they are as deeply seated as pronouns. And of course, there are exceptions. And so you have to do it because reasons. And you just leave it there without any expression of any kind of article or anything that would surround it. That is something new, but I don't think that that's going to take over the grammar in general. And conjunctions can be, especially the shorter ones, they can be extremely conservative. And so, for example, I know a few duller subjects than changes in the use of and from Old English until now. There's just nothing to say. In Middle English, it was and. In Old English, it was ond. And it was just doing the same thing. And but changed a little bit more in sound and a little bit in terms of function. But those things tend to stay the way they are, even if the Normans invade, and they don't get replaced by French and Latin as much, especially the most basic ones. So no, those I think they're going to sit. It's the bigger words that are going to be more subject to changes.
But can you give an example?
So for example, reduce. Reduce used to mean to return something to its original state. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. We're going to reduce them to their former victories, lead them back to their former victories. Or we're going to reduce them to misery, with it implied that the misery was something that they had suffered before. Another thing I happen to be reading is about it's a podcast, and it's about the French Revolution, and they're often talking about, we're going to reduce our enemies to their former misery, that sort of thing. That changed, and now we only use reduce to mean the negative thing, and so to make something smaller, and it doesn't imply anything that was going on before. All that has happened to reduce over the past, 200 years. I don't know where reduce is going now, but that is the kind of change that can happen. What's a word that's ooching now? Infer and imply. People are not clear on what the difference in the meanings are, to the point that I don't think they ever will be. And so what are you inferring? Or what are you implying? That's just going to go by the wayside. The way obnoxious originally meant subject to harm. I hate to think of this, but the woman tied on the railroad tracks, she was obnoxious, meaning not that she was bothering people, but that the train was going to come and harm her. Obnoxious happened to sound like noxious, and so people started using it to mean annoying. In a grammar book of 1900, you will always have some guy with a mustache and 3 names complaining that people aren't using the word right. But here we are, because that's just the way things go. That's normal.
That guy sounds obnoxious.
He is. Richard Grant White, yes.
What are the peeves that, as a linguist, I mean, there are certain things that people say that drive me nuts, and I'm not even an expert on this. So what are the things that you see either on the internet or that you see in real life people say? Oh,
I've got one, but it's kind of weird. You can't just walk into the room and start screaming. That's a sentence. You can't just walk into the room and start screaming. You can't simply walk into the room. So you can't just. Most people say just can't in that sentence. You just can't walk into the room and start screaming, and they don't mean you simply can't walk into the room. They mean you can't simply. So why that? Why? You just can't walk in, and it's not new, because I've seen it on an episode of The Lucy Show in the 1960s. She says, Viv, you just can't. And so it goes back to at least then, and Lucille Ball was born in 1908, so she learned to speak in the teens. So it probably goes back to the teens. You just can't, or whoever wrote the script. I hate that. I always want the person to say, you can't just, but instead, for some reason, like the DNA didn't transcribe right, when people come to can't just, they always snip it and put the just before. Life should be better. I just don't like it. But I'm not going to ever say that in public.
What about overestimate and underestimate? These are the two that drive me crazy. People who you always use them wrong. Where they say,
what do they do?
They say like, so if something is very large, they'll say, you can't underestimate the importance of this thing. And you're like, no, that's not the way you use that word. You're talking about overestimating, and it's like, and I'm going to be the guy with the mustache, just like, actually, and I know I'm the obnoxious one for trying to point it out, but I just want to pull them aside and be like, that's not right.
Yeah.
Oh, and weary and wary. I literally heard a very smart man the other day saying, he was like, if somebody does that at the table, I get weary. And I'm like, you get tired, you get suspicious,
Was
because I
that-
feel like that's wary.
Was that only him, or have you heard it?
No, I've heard it a ton of times. I might have done it. I'm not trying to be snotty. I just mean like these are, you go through
Then
life and
They're
things
falling
kind of
together. Yeah, that might be a thing.
trip you up.
Yeah.
Anyway, now that's a whole new thing for you to be annoyed by. You're welcome.
I'm going to listen for it.
Do you have plans? Are you just going to write another book, or what are your
Just-
plans going forward?
I don't know. The next book might be about hot button words. It might be about words that, like, for example, diversity. Franklin D. Roosevelt would be baffled listening to our conversations where we use the word in that way. And it's been a very interesting development, and there are linguistic lessons in it. I want to write a book about Looney Tunes because I adore them.
You kind of did, just to be clear. There's a lot of
way
Looney
too
Tunes
much in
there.
there. But there are 1,000 of them. And it's at the point where you can collect a great many of them on home video, and almost all the rest of them are online. And if you're like me, you're of the generation that grew up watching them week after week after week. And I never let it go. I've passed it on to my kids. And they have a really interesting history from 1930 to 1964 in particular. And I've always just kind of wanted to write about them. But I don't know if anybody would read that book. And you get to the point where you don't want to go to all that effort and have 7 people read it. And so you have to put a hook on it. And some people have said, well, it should be about you and your life in watching Looney Tunes. But for one thing, it's not like they've been my whole life. And also, what they're really saying is, you should write a memoir. Because once you're almost 60, people think you want to write about your life. I don't want to write about my mother. I don't want to write about, I was at Berkeley and I had a grand old time, except I didn't like George. Don't say his name, except there are people who I didn't like. Or then I moved to New York City and I've been there 23 years. I got divorced, blah, 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 blah. That's not a book, and certainly not when it's about Bugs Bunny. So I genuinely don't know what's next, but I have to come up with an idea soon, my agent says.
Well, I think the thing about Looney Tunes that's fun to watch is how, even today, like if you grew up on it, you can see how adult it is. Like there are some references in there that you're just like, wow, I did not
had no idea.
realize that the first time I saw that.
Yeah. You got things out of them when you were 6, and then when you're 40, you're getting a whole new layer of things. And they were also beautiful. The drawing was fantastic. The music was better. They're not all gems, but they're all good, and some of them are incredible. But there have been books written already, but that's the one that's really sitting in me. But I don't think anybody will let me write it. So.
Well, a man who can pick the color of his own book,
that's as far
I think, can get his Looney Tunes book published.
Daffy Duck.
I'm hoping. All right, so we got some questions here from the audience. So I like this question because you actually talk about this in the book. What has bothered me about they is not the gender neutrality, but rather the mismatch with the number, right? Using they for singular when it means plural. What do you think of they is when referencing the singular? Because you do talk about an idea for... Yeah,
I like the idea that if it's referring to a person, a specific person, then you would say they wants or they is. However, I wrote that in 2023, and I've kind of road tested that with people, and people seem to not like it. I think that really the way most people use it who are using the new they is that they use it with the regular they's markings. And so they want to go to the store, you say about a person. Roberta is at the airport, and they wonder whether you can get a haircut there, not they wonders. I would prefer they wonders. I would like to get used to that, but I get the feeling that's pushing human beings too far, that's just pronouns are too deeply seated. And so I would insist on the capital T. I'm going to push that one for 10 years. But the they wants, maybe not. And so I think that the proper way, quote unquote, is they want. And that's just the way it has to be, unfortunately.
All right, we're stuck with that. Okay, when does a change in the way we use language become too awkward or inconvenient, especially with languages like Spanish where there aren't easy neuter options? Like at what point do we just say that's it? We're not accommodating that.
Well, the truth is that, say in Spanish, Latinx is clearly never going to catch on beyond a certain rarefied set. And there's nothing wrong with that. They can say Latinx. It doesn't hurt most Latino people. And there are attempts to not, frankly, Latinx is ugly, but Latine is not. And so you can say instead of Latino or Latina, Latine. That's kind of pretty. That's something people have tried. That also will only ever be used by academics, activists, and a few artists. But that means that there is a new kind of jargon. But in some cases, no, it probably will be too awkward. German is trying for some things that I really think, I mean, I'm going to prognosticate about this country I don't live in. These things are not going to be around in 10 years, I'm guessing, because they don't look good on paper. They aren't anything anybody would want to say, trying to get rid of the gender binary on all nouns where you need it. Student versus female student, it's awkward. It depends on the language and the climate in each country. But often, I think we're talking about something that's only going to be used by a small set anyway. Whereas with the new they, the idea is that we're all supposed to be using it.
And that you think it'll be easy enough. And you're actually right that the young people are using it pretty easily.
If you watch the young people. Because, if it's you or me, we're thinking that's never going to feel right. And it's never going to feel primordial to us. But I've watched my own kids using it without a thought. And so that just means, pretty soon they'll be grown. And that's how language changes as well. People internalize something young, and then they're doing it with gray hair. That has happened with the new like, for example. We think of like as somebody 15. I've seen people 55 talking that way because it started in the late 70s, and now here we are. Yeah.
That is terrible.
I've gotten used to it.
I was at an event the other day and there was an audience question, and the person, and I use like all the time. I'm not throwing stones, but this person in the course of asking a single question said the word like
times.
Like so much.
It's punctuation.
And it was hard to even understand what this person was saying, and I was a little shocked.
Using it too much qualifies as inarticulate, but using it the way the typical teenager or 20-something uses it just in regular conversation is actually very rich and subtle if you know what to listen for. That said, I have had some students where I've thought it's literally every fourth word. It's this person's version of And yeah, it gets, however, this is something. What it does is it fills in or a pause. And the thing is, what was it like before? And how much do we remember exactly how ordinary people spoke in 1972? How do you find it? Archie Bunker, et cetera, those people are reading from a script. If it's a newscaster, they're reading from this. Somebody sent me this precious cache of tapes of this distressed northeastern white family, their psychotherapy sessions. And all I know is their last name and their ages. And somebody in the family sent me these recordings of these people in the era, roughly, of Love Story, just talking. And what they do, instead of saying like, is they all keep pausing. It's like, blah, 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 blah. And I remember thinking at one point, I wish this man almost did say like, because I'm tired of waiting for him. And they all do that. So which is better?
Wow.
It's weird. Yeah.
Toastmasters.
Take
care of that.
He needed Toastmasters.
Take care of that. And that sounds like a new book, is the psychotherapy sessions of a very dysfunctional family in the 70s. Sounds amazing. You could call it Looney Tunes.
Actually, you've got me thinking. Because some of those people had some really serious problems. Yeah.
So can you elaborate on how pronouns have served as shifting markers of identity and power?
Sort of, although English doesn't really have enough of them for that story to be a very rich one, but especially with the way thou and you were used. And you would use you with your set to indicate that you were of higher birth, and then you would call the servants thou. The servants would use thou among one another and say you to the people, quote unquote, above them. In middle class families, the man would refer to his wife as thou. She would usually refer to him as you, except to strike an intimate note. So there's lots going on with you in those times in particular. There used to be an optional in Old English, not optional, some dialects had it, some dialects didn't, a female they. And so they guys and then they gals. There was a they gals word. And so you could use they in that particular way. But you is the main place where English did that, as opposed to, say, Japanese, where you could talk about Japanese and how you mark identity and power. Even with pronouns, you could do a 15-minute segment on it. I'm sure somebody has on YouTube. But English doesn't lend itself to that. European languages in general don't. The peninsula of Asia called Europe has a bunch of languages that are unusual in many ways, but not in terms of richness of pronouns compared to what tends to happen, for example, the further east you go in Asia. Languages just differ in what sorts of things they obsess about, and European languages don't obsess about pronominal gradations, as we would call it. Nevertheless, with English, especially with thou and you, there was a stab at that sort of thing, but it's now gone.
Well, one of the things you do talk about is the you guys versus you gals.
Oh yeah, that one. That's right. Yeah.
In the book, and it's funny because you start with the opening number of Legally Blonde the musical, and it's called "Hey You Guys."
Oh my God, you guys, and they're girls and they're pink. Yeah.
But the idea that women use guys when we talk to each other. I use bro when I talk to if something happens, I'm on Slack during the meeting when I'm supposed to be paying attention. I'm like, bro, did you hear that?
And that's to a woman?
And that's to a woman, from me
wow.
to a woman.
I didn't know that.
I use, or dude. And it's something I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about, but that it's sort of is seen as a little upsetting for some folks that we use the masculine to mean everybody, sort of or even as a default. But I'll tell you, I had a job where I was with my boss was an older person who called me a gal, and I was like, stop. It was so weird. He was like, where are you gals going? And I was like, please don't say that. It was for some reason so
awkward.
strange.
Yeah.
But we really don't have that equivalent on the female side. And
No,
you do talk about the issue with that in the book.
Yeah, actually, the female you guys is neat because that guys isn't the same word as the male guys. It's done something called grammaticalization. So with that guys, it no longer has the masculine part. It's now just people. And so when women do that, there have been some very intelligent arguments that for women to call each other you guys is an effacement of feminineness. But I don't think that's what it means. And it's awkward for me, this aging male person, to be dwelling on this. But I don't think that the women are using it. Well, I know that they're not using it to mean men. They're using it just to mean. And so there are two guys. There's the guy, and then there's the one that the women are using because there was nothing else available. It isn't going to be you gals because gals is, as you're saying, loaded. It sounds kind of like Anne Sheridan or the 40s or the 50s, and it's kind of diminishing. And so you need something. And frankly, that's the English story. There isn't enough. We don't have enough pronouns. And so you need something in there, and so you're going to use guys. And I think it's a great thing. It's better than you gals or ladies or something like that. I used ladies once with some people who were not men. And they very nicely, I was in my 20s, and they said, we don't want this. And so, what do you do? And so solutions have to be creative. Yeah. Definitely.
But one of the things you say in the book is that it's okay for women to call each other that, but if men are in mixed company, they shouldn't say, hey, guys, to refer to everybody, which I can tell you, I'm as a woman who attends the meetings of all the women, we get together and make decisions. It's fine.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting to hear.
Again, from my chapter of the Lady Club.
I have heard other people in this lady club feel otherwise, but that might change over time because really what else is there? I say folks or people if it's graceful, but that was a learned response. But you don't mind guys.
No. And maybe it's my age cohort that just didn't really think too hard about it, and it's sort of
if no one has done a survey of that, someone who is not me needs to. It'd be interesting to see whether that goes by generation.
Remember there was a show, Hey You Guys? It was I think it was a Nickelodeon show.
It was called that, or do you mean
Yeah,
the
it was
electric
called.
company?
No, it was. Was it the
Remember
electric
Rita
company?
Moreno
It
would
was,
come
hey,
out and
you
say,
guys-
hey, you guys, and
Oh,
she
yeah.
didn't mean only men.
Yeah.
She meant everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm third grade. I felt included. Anyway, I'm sorry, we are totally off subject. Alrighty, we have reached our time limit. On that
Remember the
note,
electric
you
company?
guys, we want to many thanks to John McWhorter, author of Pronoun Trouble: The Story of Us in 7 Little Words. I encourage you to pick up a copy of this book right here or at
purple.
your local bookstore. It is purple, like the author demanded. And for more information about membership or upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Melissa Kane. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next time.
Thank you, folks.